seul truc qui manque dans cette lettre, ça fait 3 pages toujours, excuse-moi. Le seul truc qui manque dans cette lettre, c'est quelques mots sur comment tu es impressionné par le contexte académique de la aide et de ce programme. Et ça, il faut que tu le mettes en intro. Je regarde ce programme, et puis il faut que tu te renseignes et que tu dises, voilà, ce programme inspire, je sais pas quoi, la façon dont vous faites ci ou ça.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. We are very happy to welcome today Anna Colin and Ève Chabanon for this talk today. And Anna Colin is an independent curator, an educator and researcher based in the UK. And she's here with Ève Chabanon, who is a visual artist, and she's based in Brussels since 2 years now. And they will present today the project A Body Without Plan. It's a project that is exploring how a planted and landscaped environment can be politically resistant and non-binary. It's also a garden project that they are starting with us and discussing with us in the next months and hopefully years, and how such a garden can feel and how such a garden can also, what kind of values such a garden can produce. So I will give the floor directly to Ève and Anne to present us this project, and after the presentation we will have time also for questions and to discuss with them the project.
Sorry, we hadn't figured something out. Yeah, maybe just a quick introduction on how I know Ève and how Ève knows me. We met in 2016. You were an associate artist at Open School East, which is an alternative art school and a communal space, which was then in London, in the UK, and then moved to Margate on the southeast coast of England. And I was a co-founder and the director of Open School East back then. So that's how the adventure started. And we have been working on a few projects together in different forms, in different places over the years. It's been 6 years. And we're excited to be here again together and to propose, if that's of interest, a project around the idea of a non-binary garden, perhaps for here. Is that good enough for introduction? Okay.
So I'm going to first introduce a bit myself and the work. So this is actually a Nicole Eisenman painting, very beautiful, but we're not on that today. So yeah, we met with Anna in London at Open School East. My practice is mainly socially engaged, and at that time it was like the main focus. And after Open School East, I've been invited by a structure named Create to work in Dagenham, which is like in East London, and to take a residency in this area. The idea was that I would stay for like 6 months and try to create kind of art on engaging with the community who was using this space. So I was living there and working there. It was a very difficult context. Brexit just happened. Most of the population then voted for it. And also there was an attentat in London at the moment that I was there, and the 2 people we attended was from the place just before, but just next to where we was working. So at that moment, I started to propose to do like kind of like a public debate around the idea of dispossession. So inviting people to discuss in a place which is a town hall that we can see pretty quickly behind me, about this idea of dispossession and what it is to be dispossessed, basically. So it was a proper public debate in the way that people was inviting to exchange and to answer to some question, but it was mainly moderated by like an actress who was like following a script. So this 6 months of residency was used mostly to write the script and try to like understand how to like manipulate a kind of public debate and the way that it's actually done during like politic systems of conversation. So it was mostly intended like a kind of a divertisement, like a moment when people can actually have good time and find a way and a safe way to discuss together. I can show you like a short video which introduces properly the project.
And how do you feel?
A little bit anxious.
Why is that?
I'm not sure I trust you.
You're not sure?
I trust you.
You're not sure you trust me? Why don't you trust me?
Your role.
Ah, my role. What do you perceive my role to be?
Mediator. I'm not entirely sure what you're mediating there.
I don't know about you, but I've never been this high before. Seriously. I'm talking about the altitude. You know, there's a lesson in this, in bringing people together where there's not enough oxygen and asking them to try and figure out what they're going to do when they can't think properly. Sorry, are there some of you here who can breathe? Can you breathe? Yeah? Then you can breathe as well. Okay. Because you were born at high altitude, right? You've got big lung cavities. But you know, when you bring people in who've not had environmental conditioning, you get one group of people who are feeling the strain and another group of people who are absolutely fine. And they're just sat there trying to figure out why you're staggering around. And that's what this debate is about tonight. I'm Chloe Cooper, and I'm here to moderate the first episode of the Anti-Social Social Club.
I said that there'll be large disputes. A natural leader will arise because that is the way of the world, and there is something within people right now that we would not be able to avoid that naturally. It would happen. Whether we would want to fight it, that's fine, but it would happen.
So to go really quick on that, the idea was to start on the way that people can all participate, or mostly participate. So how to make people comfortable with the fact to talk publicly and to interact together. So what you can see at some point on this trailer was like kind of exercise that we start with to make people hear their voice, love together, kind of like have some game and just feel more and more comfortable and able to like speak together. And then the first question of the debate was, are you okay? And then nobody answered like right now, because it's not so easy to go in. So like, again, more and more exercise. And step after step, it was like more and more question. And one of them was, for example, who in this room feel independent? And then the independent, please hand up. And then the dependent. And then picking someone, so in the script, it was like picking someone looking like this kind of person on the room and say like, okay, so why are you independent? And then picking two people who look like this and this, and let them speak about why they're dependent, and then do again the vote. And slowly, it's like kind of like building a way of like manipulating mind by the way to like actually give space to affect. And at some point of the debate, it was like too much affect maybe, and it's getting maybe too personal and not that easy to answer. So we asked kind of like invoke a fiction. So at that point, it was like, okay, to keep going, we will say like, let's close all the door, like just close, not with locked, and say there is a zombie attack in this country or in this city, and the only way to survive is to stay together inside of this room and to figure out how we can organize something to live together. And then the question come back, and step by step, we have like kind of like a whole organization made by the people in the room who was not prepared to that event. And at some point, we can hear some like, which was like some people who decide to left at the very beginning. And these people are coming back, and they're coming back with other people, and they ask to come in and say like, can we stay? And then the new vote is, can we let them in? And then the debate is like, why yes, why no? And again, another group, and each group is representing part of the society, and the debate is about like, can they stay with us? And are we able to survive together? So what is actually a coalition? That's why it's called the Chamber of the Dispossessed, and this whole idea of coalition is around that. The emplacement was also really important in the way that it's a town hall, so it's like a place of political decisions, mainly made by like a group of the population, and it's not accessible. It's public but not accessible. So the fact to try to do this debate in this place was also like a reclaim this possibility of talking and power. And also in France, a lot of people ask me about the diversity of the crowd. And like they asked me how I curated it, and the curation was basically made by the fact to stay for 6 months in a place, talk with people, work with like different organizations, work in different schools, try to have, for example, all the documentation made by students from schools that is made for adults who want to go back on their study, and just go more and more locally as possible, and create proper link basically. I go really, really fast, and I swap because we share time. And I go straight to like another big project on which we actually start to work together with Anna. Which called the surplus. So at the very beginning, it's Anna who was curator at Lafayette Anticipations Foundation in Paris, and who invite me with other curators to work for like the second show of this foundation at the opening. The first idea was for me to collaborate with a school who was teaching French for people in exile in Paris. And my first question was like, why this institution? This was not your idea, actually. It was an idea of the director of the institution. And so the question was like, why do you need me to work with these people in your institution? And what do you expect from them, and what do you expect from me? And how to do something that would be like not just exotizing other people, and not just like bringing like a political discussion that we will not really have. So how to not be like non-performative speech, kind of. So we kind of have like a lot of meetings while I was working on this with this charity. So during 6 months, I go there to just assist classes and meet people and try to understand. And meanwhile, we was talking about like where is the risk and who is actually taking it, and who is actually like hanging the power in this system. And after 6 months, we decided to not work together, not because it was not fitting, but because it was not like a smart way to do something in terms of like exhibition space in this foundation. But I met a lawyer who introduced me to other places, and the idea was all these people were learning at this school have one thing in common, which is like their inability to do their practice. So some of them was doctors, some of them was students, some of them was like, I don't know, gardeners, but none of them was actually doing what they used to do in this country. So the first idea was like how to go back to your practice and what is like this accessibility of practice. And then we focused it on the field of art, which was like my field. So I was more able to help and understand how to practice that. And then we take the foundation was like mainly like a system of communication and like a political kind of instance that could help us to go through some element like this. So I met a lot of other charities, and one of them was working with like craft people. And I met Abu Dubaef, who's like a stuccator, a stucco marble master. And this person used to have like a huge workshop where he was working on like giant kind of sculpture in architecture, and was now like not able to do anything that much, but just small objects, which was not representing his practice that much. So the idea was first to go to the foundation, ask to use the workshop, and also to ask for the budget of production of the exhibition to be used as like to create a salary contract for Abu, because one of the main things was also the accessibility of work, so the legal right to work for people in exile, depending of their status. So it was creating the whole system of what is like actually a practice. It's like a different kind of thing, but it's also like how to provide the materials that you need, how to provide the help and the understanding that you need, etc., etc. So for like 2-3 months, I don't remember, we worked together really closely to understand how we can show his practice and can make him like able to go back on it. So I designed for him kind of like a big table, which was like a kind of map and also like a demonstration of all his capacity, but also its limitation of what can be done on his like mastering of like faking stones. So it's what we see on the back, for example. Where is the here. So it's mainly, it's just done with plaster, pigment, and a kind of natural glue. And then it's just craftsmanship, kind of. So for the first show, we mainly exhibit these pieces, which is like quite heavy. It's like 3 meter long, 2 meter large, quite imposant. And from that, we said like, this is a stone from like a kind of like a system. So let's use this idea of like creating like a employment kind of for people who kind of reclaim their own job, and let's do a film, because the film is like a small industry by itself. So my job will be like to find the grants and to find the money, and then to like create a team that will work closely together to build something like this. So after like, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 charities, we met like the whole team. So for example, someone doing like the script writing, someone doing the music, someone doing the production, from all different, totally different backgrounds and country and everything. But just the idea that was like, yeah, you paid for what you're supposed to do. And you have like the whole kind of system going with it, which was also my job kind of. And then quickly, I was working on a lot of other projects. The thing didn't really go as we wanted, and it took more and more time. And at some point, I reached this moment when I was like not able to work anymore in community, because I was like reaching too many people in the same time. I was not able to make a living from it. I was not able to like focusing enough of the needed of the people that I get involved in the projects. And I did what we mainly do in this situation, like a proper burnout. And then I get out for a while, saying like, okay, we need a break. We done a lot of workshops, a lot of filmings, a lot of like conversation. It took like 2 years. It was not like just this. But yeah, during this break, I did like what mostly people in like their 30s do during burnout. I started ceramics, and, and that was really useful. And when I came back, I was invited to show what was this project, which was like really dense project with like a lot of events, but kind of nothing to be able to like to bring together in one pieces, like what would be like a proper narrative film or documentary, for example. That could be, but I was not interested at the time to do that like this. So I tried to think about it, how like this can become like an exhibition. So it became first an exhibition in Paris, in Béton Salon, where the stucco marble was shown, and then a lot of footage from the different workshops we did with all the people who get involved in the project. So some workshops with economists, Catherine Gibson, for example, but also workshop with like kids from the suburb of Paris and high school, where we was like doing like kind of talks. So like the people involved in the project was explaining, like have a day to explain what they was doing, what was their craft basically, and then try to like teach it. For another day. And then we record sounds, we record like a lot of elements, and this was like kind of like feature during this show. So I go again quickly. Then this show moved to Münster in Germany. And at that moment, the big question was how to bring all the language together. And this is how ceramics came back, kind of. So this was these screens, which was directly linked to the sounds. So the video didn't add sounds by themselves, all the different settings, but there was like a kind of one big soundtracks linked to these screens. We were like kind of like giving subtitles in different language, but also like explaining kind of all the language that was recording in the video. And then another ceramics happened. I feel totally stupid with this. So those was some mugs that was displaying during all the shows. So every show I have like a new kind of like collection. Every time there is like 100 mugs produced that I'm doing in my studio. So this is what I call my yoga system. So like every day I just sit on the wheel and I just do ceramics. But I do really basic ceramics. I'm not doing sculpture or anything. I'm just doing mugs, just to be clear. And those mugs was kind of like the reclaimed time or money that I don't make during this kind of show. So there's 100 mugs. They all sell at different price. So basically, if you arrive at the exhibition, you're the first one, you get the first mugs, which is like under 20 euros. Then the second person gets a second one, which is a bit more expensive, and it's growing like this until the last one, which is like a price that we don't want to talk about. But as the system was designed with an economist who's like mostly working on like kind of like the art system economy, and so we kind of like creating a shape that was explaining my economy of that. So like the first one is what I actually do. So like I work mainly to not get the money. So I'm like under what I'm supposed to have to get the living. And then the second one was like what I was supposed to do if I just want to just cover the expense. And then the third one, and then the last one is actually the collection price, like the collector price. And I never sell it. So yeah, every time we're doing like another collection, kind of. And of course, when we start the sale, I mainly started with like the interns from the institution with who I work, or like the people who have like the least money, kind of, or the students we were doing workshop, because I always kind of like get involved with the surrounding of the institution with who I work. So yeah, so this exhibition goes in like 3 different places, in Munster in Germany, and finally in the Beurs in Brussels. And then I decided to stop it. So the last show was called Sold. Every time the show was kind of like re-edited totally and like re-transformed. And now I'm working on the book, which is like covering all these principles, all these ideas, all the collaborators who make it possible, but also who create kind of like a thinking about this possibility of working together, creating labor, and the whole system of economy that is like passing through. And I'm going to stop soon, just to introduce the project that I have at the moment. I'm working on the sculpture, public sculpture in Kortrijk, where it's mostly about thinking about what would be like a feminism public sculpture. So like what would be like a sculpture that is not taking space that much, which is not like lasting forever, which doesn't mean that you have to come back and again to like maintain it. That sculpture that nobody's own. And like, so all of this is made in collaboration with like a group of like maybe 20 women living there, and non-binary people who join and who basically are in the production system of the sculpture. So like we design the way to make it as a kind of school for building, thinking that women and non-binary are mainly people who are kind of like pushed out of the possibilities to learn, kind of like direct craft system to like do restoration or building at their own place, and creating like this kind of patrimony and money kind of system. So it's kind of like a school of building at the same time like a public sculpture. So this will be launched in 2030, hopefully. 23, sorry. And thank you. And then I'm also working on a PhD at the moment on the poet who's like Malaysian and American, named Justin Chin, and who kind of disappeared. He's like mainly known in San Francisco in like a really small surrounding, because he also passed away from aid at a really young age after published like 5 books, but who also like stopped to be published, perhaps 2. So the PhD mainly about like recovering kind of like a archive of his work and like a whole system to make him present basically again and literature, but also doing the first translation of his first book of poetry. And this translation is mainly thinking in like collaborative systems, how to do like a group translation, thinking about what will be like a queer translation, which is like this layering of thinking, because Justin Shin is bringing a lot of subjects that need to be talked as well. And also the whole main subject will be like about how translation can be seen and used as a practice of drag. Yeah. And I don't want to talk about mushroom for now, but we will.
Thank you. Should I use this one? This one, yeah, cool. Yeah, you can put the slide. I will skip some of them. That was a bit ambitious. So anyway, thank you, Nico and Judith, for your invitation to be here. And I'm just going to present a few projects and my practice through some projects that are early, kind of things I did about 15 years ago, and that I've engaged with the subjects of nature, the colonization of natural history, land rights, land ownership, soil, botany, nature as an emancipatory classroom, nature as a model for democracy. And I'll talk about some projects that also connect us with Ève and that are driven by the same ethics than those that drive me to work in connection to the natural environment today. And I will also finish with some more recent curatorial and life projects that testify to a more hands-on rather than strictly conceptual approach to working with the natural environment. So the first slide we have is a project from 2008. Was it? Yeah. It was called Disclosures 2, the Middle Ages. There was a Disclosures 1 and then a 3 and a 4, but I won't get too much into it. It was a bit of a curatorial platform that I co-founded with a colleague of mine called Mia Jankovic back then. And it was a project that was looking at the relationship between the agricultural commons and the digital commons. It was located in the village of Laxton in Nottinghamshire. Laxton is a very small village, which is the last surviving example of a pre-enclosure model. So they still have common land, they still rotate the land, and all the land is being used by the farmers and villagers there without having to be landowners or landlords. And yeah, I'm sure many of you will have heard about the enclosure system, but it was basically the birth of private property. It was a way of kind of privatizing the land, which led to many things, including the birth of wage labor and the relegation of women to the domestic sphere. And it was, a subject that was widely written about by Silvia Federici back then, about the same time, I think 2007 or 6, in Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body and Primitive Accumulation. I won't go too much into it, but we worked with artists, media practitioners, farmers, social historians, local historians, and had a day of walks, talks, presentations, games, food, and various things. So that's really the first time I kind of got into the subject. You can go to slide 2 really quickly. That's a show I did at Gasworks in 2010 called Everything Has a Name or the Potential to be Named, and was looking at the renaming of nature in the process of the colonization of the Americas, so really from Canada to Latin America through to the US and Central America, with a few artists kind of working in these areas and talking about the change of use, the eradication of knowledge, cosmologies, and uses of different plants, species, and also nature, like rivers, land, and of course people. moving on to the next one, which was quite a similar show. It was at Béton Salon, where Ève did a show about 10 years later. It was called Tropicomania, The Social Life of Plants, and that was in 2012 during the Paris Triennial, curated by Okui and Weather. It was one of the satellite venues. And, you know, quite similarly, we worked on, not so much, it wasn't so geographical, it was more kind of widespread and was looking at the trajectory of plants and the birth of global trade routes through the exoticization and the kind of the export of natural products and produces like pineapples and bananas, coffees, sugar. And we worked with quite a few artists, including Otobong and Kanga, who all of you hopefully will know because she lives here and she's working with the Academy. Moving on to the next one very quickly again. I worked on a project around the figure of the witch as a metaphor for queer and feminist anticipation for a long time, which led to too long, which led to a few exhibitions and a couple of books. But the reason why I'm showing it here was that it was a continuation of, I guess, my interest in the spaces of the margin and alternatives. And kind of alternative ways of living, of educating oneself, of surviving the kind of back then capitalist system, nowadays the neoliberal system, and was looking at how queers and feminists have appropriated the figure of the witch as in its kind of double function and role, one as a victim of the transition between feudalism to capitalism, which the enclosure movement is part of, but second, as a figure that can be in communion with the natural and spiritual world, the witch as a botanist, the witch as someone who can understand the non-human and more than human world and protects and care for what's around us. So, yeah, briefly, it was just and that's some pictures from one of the shows in Quimper. Let's move on. But the same year, I was busy in 2012, seemingly. I co-founded an alternative art school and communal space called Open School East, which that was, 2012. We opened in 2013. You joined in 2016 for a year. And so that's some of the buildings. We were in East London, and then we moved to Margate on the southeast coast of England. And if you put the next picture, it shows a little bit the kind of stuff we did. I was there for 8 years, and I left last year once it was finally on its feet and solid enough for me to detach myself from it. But I left after way too long. I should have left before. I was always warned that if you create alternatives, it can only be alternative for 5 years, and after that, if you don't get out, it joins the mainstream, and it kind of becomes its worst enemy, which it did, and that's partly why I left. But we can go back. That's the subject of my PhD. It's it's looking at alternative educational, cultural, and social spaces, and I guess the time span of alternatives and what solutions might be to avoid to fall into what you initially instituted yourself, and what you initially stood against, essentially. So yeah, basically, what is the lifespan of an alternative, and what are the options not to fall into what you negated in the first place? And so we had different programs, 4 programs working with artists, adult artists, on the associates program, which was quite a self-directed program for artists who came. It was like a residency for a year. They had a studio. They were very active programming their own kind of events and workshops, kind of learning and inviting and kind of also introducing themselves to people they might want to collaborate with in future, and inviting the public in while sharing the space with other programs. Bit by bit, it grew into something bigger, working with young people who were school dropouts and who had nowhere else to go, and so we wanted to try and help them maintain themselves in education, but through a more critical pedagogy using art. We worked with children as well. We worked with people who were in situations of social isolation, homeless people, people with a learning disability, senior citizens, etc. So it's still going, and it's going strong, and it's exciting because it's getting really different to what it was when I was there. So that's healthy. So it's not alternative because it's become a fully fledged charity under huge pressures, but it's still a non-accredited art school. And that's the project Ève just talked about at Lafayette, and then the following one is just to show some connections. That was the project, the Visible Award, which is curated by Judith Villander and Matteo Lucchetti. And so while I was at Lafayette, we brought the Visible Award into 2019 to Paris. And the reason why I'm putting it here is just to draw connections, but also because Ève was one of the long-listed artists for that award with the surplus of the non-producer. And moving on, I think that's getting a bit more contemporary. That's last year, so 2021. So it's a project I did and that Ève participated in as well. I worked with a curator called Cédric Fauque on something called the Assembly of Values, and it was looking at the values that very much in the contemporary art sector, the values that we would like to see and that we believe are missing, and that could be anything from environmental awareness and action in institutional settings, but also in art schools. Like, how do your art school engage with sustainability in your workshops, in the materials and the processes you teach artists? That's something I'm very keen on, but that's not developing very quickly. But also anything from racial and gender equality, topics around inclusion and access, around disability and illness, payment, precarity, etc. And Ève moderated one of the embassies. We had 10 embassies, and you had the artist embassies, and made proposals that were voted. Your proposal was the first one, actually. I mean, it was quite simple, but it just doesn't exist in France. That was at the Villa Arson in Nice. It was to kind of create a pay scale, a fair pay scale for artists by institutions who still don't pay artists in France. And then the next project is very good. It's connected to it, and it was an iteration of that project around values. It was called devaluation, so looking at kind of what's been devalorized, devalued, and that needs to be valued, revalued. So Ève again made a poster for it, and we had all sorts of things. We were working with a group of students from Montpellier and went to see lots of alternative places in the Limousin region at the convergence between art and agriculture. Anyway, big long project. That's the film realized with the students, by the students. And the final project is something I'm really keen on. I mean, not that I wasn't keen on the rest, but that feels it feels a bit like a turning point for me. It was last year as well, in Margate, so not far from where I live in Kent. I was invited to curate a small festival, and the theme was ecology, and they knew I was interested in the subject, that I was training as a gardener, as a garden designer, and I was training in horticulture, which I'll talk about in a moment. And they said, "What, do you want to do a show there?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, we'll do something, but I'd like to do it outside, and it's convenient because with COVID, everything is shutting down all the time, so we don't want to take any risk." And there's this garden who I love, which is not in the center of Margate, but slightly off the beaten track, where you rarely see any art happening there. And it happens to be run by a community group that is working very closely with kind of pollinators, conservation and revival, etc. And it's called the Sunken Garden because it's excavated in the cliff, in the choke cliff, and it's It's a really kind of calm, beautiful place. And I asked the people, the community group that run the project, like, if you, because they were interested in working with us, but I was like, actually, what can art do for you? Because we don't want to just do something parachuted something in. We want to actually be useful. And how can you take advantage of the funding, of the ideas, of maybe some of the skills, of the press that there might be, and put it at the advantage of your garden? And we're like, oh, there are lots of things we want to do and we don't have. We need a compost bin. We need to repair some tiles. We need a gate to close that grotto so we can finally store our tools and we don't have to bring them all the time. We need more seating. And so I invited a number of artists. On the left, Olu Ogonaike, who's a British artist, who made a bench, which is more like a sculptural environment for a family or friends to congregate and look at the garden. A compost bin, which is, small, but if you just go down slightly so we can see the top. No. This, yeah, so we can see it. So it's just a gesture because we have got bigger composted needs there, but it's just a symbol for something bigger that could happen with everything that's inside the compost bin usually. So slugs and, whatever, rats and things, and lots of food refuse. They are outside and they kind of, being digested out by the compost bin. And then we've got gate, and then we had an artist from Open Schoolies doing terrazzo tiles and teaching people how to do it and then setting them into the stone. Lots of events happened. It was active for 2 weeks. It was quite an interesting project anyway. And I mean, interesting for me in terms of kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life and being dissatisfied with working in institutions and curating exhibitions. And the last thing is my training, my reconversion, partly as where I'm doing horticulture, practical horticulture once a week for a year, and I'm also starting to design gardens and learning about it, and that's the first garden I've redesigned and planted recently. So that's it. I guess maybe to say why I'm doing that is that I've always been interested in, well, in nature, I guess, but and in public art and in art in general, and thinking about this, I've been a bit disillusioned by the overly conceptual discourse on ecology of late, and there's nothing better to understand the place where I would like to work more and put artists at the contribution of nature and of agriculturists and of farmers, and because we have a climate urgency and a food urgency, and that's, I'm not going to pretend I'm going to open a farm. I don't have the money to start a farm or anything, but perhaps I can help think a bit differently about how art, without being ashamed to instrumentalize art and to think of art as maybe we think of design, and how can art not compete with nature and actually provide solutions, or something to dream about, or something discursive to think about, but I needed to get my hands dirty and to kind of understand and fail, how understand the soil, understand cycles, understand what works and what doesn't, in what climate, in what environment, what are the so I'm not growing food or anything, but I'm interested in kind of designing or curating outdoor spaces, and particularly in institutions, art institutions, because I guess that's a bit my world. I see a lot of really dire, empty, grassy gardens outside of institutions, and I think what a shame. It could be so exciting, and what people do when they have a bit of money is they invite a big, household name of, garden designer from Holland or from here or from the UK, and then they just put a lot of money in it. It's a beautiful display, and then the art becomes this thing that comes in for 6 months, gets removed. There's no dialogue, and I'm interested in how we can actually have this really close dialogue and think together with artists and with garden designers and gardeners and people who work the land and people from the area who need a bit of space to grow vegetables, etc., and how this whole process can be also a learning process, and how we can think more, holistically about this dialogue between nature and art in a way that's not toxic and also to decelerate the way we work, or I have used to work. I'm used to working with artists, just commissioning them to do something really quickly with very little money. It's like, no, well, a garden takes 3 years to establish. You know, what about we take the same time to commission art? So here's my little contribution. Sorry, it was a bit long. So I guess maybe we can start talking about the project really quickly. I'll let you talk about the title, because we've proposed a project which is called A Body Without Plan, Landscaping with Gut.
Yeah. So that's the moment for mushrooms. So a couple of years ago, I've been invited for a public commission in a cultural cafe, which looks a bit like Open Schoolist, but adding this cafe and restaurants in the suburb of Paris. And the idea was to create a kind of like living library. So using things that are alive to transmit. So producing something that is not for you to consume or for the person who produced it to consume, but for the next one. So we start to think a lot about ferment and collecting ferment and mushrooms and using the places that have been not used in the cafe to grow stuff and also create a record and like a way to edit and archive this, who is bringing what in terms of recipes and in terms of like proper ferment and like bacteria. And then the pandemic arrived and the project stopped. And I've been left alone with all these ferments and bacteria and mushrooms, which is not totally true because we're working on a great recipes book at the moment. But so I was home, and home for me, it's like a place that I share with 20 people, which is like a big community space. And we have this room named La Brocante, the second-hand shop, in this community where we leave all the clothes that we don't want to wear anymore for the others, kind of. So we always see like how clothes is coming back in life with people. And some are like just like left here forever. And so I start to think about the mushroom and like what can be like used to grow them in a more interesting way. And this community that we like, this kind of like family that we're recreating and rethinking all the time. And I collect like clothes made with like cotton, and I start to grow mushroom on them. So doing like big package and stuff like this. And it actually worked really well. And the effect, which was like intended kind of, was like what would be the effect of the mycelium inside of the fabrics. So what would like, how we would like tie and dye it. So it creates like beautiful patterns. If you leave it a bit too much, of course, it's just like destroying the old fabric. If you leave it just in time, it's just doing like kind of like a bleach system, because some of the mushroom are creating chemicals that is like close to bleach. So I'm using this fabric to recreate pieces and remaking things that's to talk about this community and this way to live together and retired kind of everything. But then I was explaining that to Anna, and she was like, I'm actually thinking about doing like maybe a garden in this place, which is your school. And you asked me that what will be like a non-binary garden, as we had this conversation about my came out as a non-binary person. And I talk a lot about the mushroom and like for me like a way, like a kind of like a time to think and to find new vocabulary and new language that we don't really have for now to describe what is a mushroom. Like in terms of science and the term that we see everything as like a binary, and mushroom defy totally this. It can't be called with the vocabulary that we have, so we have to recreate a kind of language to be able to work or live with this mushroom and like be able to understand a bit more about them because we know so less about it. And so it's part of kind of like a everyday life for me to like look at this and try to understand what will be like this kind of queer mycology. And then I let you go with that.
Yeah. And then we hear there might be another garden project here, which is super exciting. So perhaps, you know, they can be, you know, for now it's just an idea. You work with mushrooms, I work with plants, and that's two different things because mushrooms are not plants. But I guess what they both do, or when plants are treated in a kind of more permacultural way, they are mutually supportive. And you know, some mushrooms I'm friends with in my garden, some mushrooms I fight because they also. So it's really interesting because this element of kind of mutual support, but also toxicity and kind of takeover. And I'm thinking, well, we were thinking what. There's this desire, you know, I guess in my training as a gardener, I'm facing lots of conventions, and I'm also thinking, you know, how can I be political in the way I garden? And it's a hard question because, you know, it's easy to follow the conventions and to learn your botanical Latin and to replicate all these systems, essentially of oppression that date from capitalism, from pre-capitalism, which date from colonialism. But how can we think of a garden that is more resistant and that actually learns from nature, which is the concept of permaculture, observes and kind of replicates, create kind of companionship between plants and organisms. And but what does it look like? What would be its values? What would be its atmosphere? What would a non-binary planted environment look like? You know, some plants are gendered, some plants are not. Some plants are toxic and there to eliminate their surrounding and protect others from, you know, pests. Pests is a big thing as well. How do you live with pests, or how do you fight pests, and how do you kind of create? But what would it mean to create a garden that perhaps does not show itself explicitly as a political environment, but you know it is, and then, you know, it's in the fabric, it's also in the landscape. How do you create elements that can help it, you know, in its maintenance, you know, in its care, what functions? Again, you know, I guess that's, we're trying to mix our interests of you working with organisms and kind of looking at how also mushrooms can help digest things, but also what we can learn from their kind of non-binary nature, and how we could apply that to the environments and the practices that we surround ourselves with. And I'm interested in also how artists or art objects made sustainably can also come and sustain, you know, the planted environment. So that's kind of our idea so far, very, very open-ended. We'd love to talk to you more about it on Thursday when we do an open-ended workshop, which you're all welcome to. But yeah, that's thing where we're at the moment. Lots of questions, lots of ideas, but nothing fixed at all. And we see it as a conversation and a learning process with theory and practice, a lot of practice, a lot of experiments, and yeah, a lot of observation.
Question time?
It could be anything. You have indoor gardens and you've got outdoor gardens, so it's all open. I guess outdoors would be, I mean, you work with the elements, you work with winds, you work with direct sunlight, you work with airflows, humidity, which you don't necessarily have inside. So I guess outside is a bit closer to, you know, the cycles that we're interested in working with. But it's
I think it's part
open.
of the workshop of like on Thursday, to try to discuss together and like maybe visit some places and try to project ourselves and see what will be interesting or like limiting us on this idea. We visit few places this morning, but I mean, there's few ideas, of course, like which is like more the obvious one, but I'm more interested about like what you guys will bring also as ideas, like this is a place that you are using, that you are inhabited, and so I think it's more interesting to see from your perspective what will be a good place for a garden. But also like how you want to, again, like create something that you will probably have to leave for others at some point. So what will be the place for that, kind of create this legacy from other students in the years to come?
Yeah, and the access is important, you know, who gets to access it, who maintains it, does it need maintenance, who cares for it, what is the stewardship around it, and yeah, how does it get passed on, and kind of, if it's a kind of student-led kind of life projects. I mean, there are lots of ways of doing it, and a garden doesn't need to be, well, it can be lots of different things, really. That's the beauty of it. You have sensory gardens, you have medicinal gardens, you have kind of social gardens, very functional ones, or something that's more, maybe more for discursive space, if that's what's needed. I mean, we've heard about the legacy of gardens here, and the gardens that are maybe in planning as well. So it seems like there's a bit of a, you know, history and a focus on, you know, the outdoors here. It's interesting to see what everyone, I mean, everyone has got to bring.
Your presentation of your practice nothing less than a big inspiration, I think. But can you maybe elaborate a bit more on your on the language of botanics, and perhaps maybe you have any recommendation in literature or publications about this matter?
Sure. So for me, it was mostly about like at the very beginning of my research on mushrooms and myceliums was like first to understand that there is not like a normative way to think about binary inside of the mushroom, and also what is even more interesting to me, I guess, it will be like we don't know what is a mushroom, in the way that we don't know how to like define where it starts and where it stops. So is it starting with the mycelium? So then maybe there is like one huge mushroom on this school, for example, or maybe there is like 1,000 kind of mushrooms, but also like the fruiting body, the one that we call mushroom, the one that we will eat, for example, or pick or like look at for the beauty, can be like one individual, or can be like a group of individuals, or maybe just like the whole thing together. So it's that for me to think totally differently in terms of scale and in terms of like what would be like a group and what could be the individual inside of like projecting society. And then I come to lichens and being amazed because I'm a bit maybe slow, but I didn't know that lichen was actually like a combination of like a mushroom and an algae. So it's like actually two living entity which coming together in one. Which also, like, I was not the only one who was slow because it's like kind of late discovery, and it kind of like amazed biologists and a lot of people to understand that, like, we are actually multiples. And so we knew it in terms of like really microscopic way, but we didn't knew it in terms of like this kind of like cellulose, like these big elements coming together, kind of, and it's kind of bringing me back on this idea that, and the fact that we are kind of like a group, even if we don't want to, kind of, and we are kind of multiple. And also like what will be like a healthy body in terms of if we think microbes have something like outside of us, or is it part of us? And that means like what will be like a sick body, for example, a body with HIV, which aid, what will be this body? Is it like considering as like something like a sick body, or is it like actually like an entire body, like another entire existing specimen who's actually living in this own way? So yeah, it's like a whole way to like reshape your vision. And so yeah, and to discover also, like for example, that there is a lot of missing words in the way that we are looking at the world. we were talking with like one of your references that we will. I have a few texts that I can share with you later on that. You can come at the workshop on Thursday. We're going to read a few of them and try to discuss them in kind of like a group system of lecture. But yeah, like the fact that we don't have this word to just say like this is appearing in one night, and some people used to have a word for that, but we forget about it. So we can't really talk about what is happening in front of us. And for me, it's like also like a pure poetry in another way. I don't know if I answer.
Someone who writes beautifully about language and botany is Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's written this great book called Breeding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge. And we've got 2 little extracts that we can listen to if you want, if you're coming on Thursday. And I mean, I can't remember what she refers to. She's a Native American botanist, but she talks about certain words that kind of signify this multiplicity you're talking about, and that in the English language just is reduced to just one meaning. And I was doing some research on kind of nature-based pedagogy a while back, and there was this reference to, there was this Native American woman somewhere in Chicago talking about weeds being not what we call, in their language, it wasn't weeds, it was those who we have lost our relationship and kinship with. And just this kind of really poetic and otherworldly ways of talking about what's around us is what I find interesting. And, you know, I'm studying very rigorous horticulture in my weekly course, and I have to learn by heart about 15 different species related to conifers or shrubs or evergreen trees or whatever. And you have to kind of learn, you know, this complex vocabulary, and we even had an exam where we were asked to say why is botanical Latin in use, and we have to give 4 reasons, and one of them is it's a universalizing language, you know, that enables you know, every country in the world to understand what species or what genus we mean, because, you know, one plant might have 3-5 common names in the English language, and they might have 3 common names in Spanish and 2 common names. So it's the way of saying, this is it, we all recognize it, but by doing that, you're also erasing the need to describe and to kind of articulate and decline not decline, that's anyway, to articulate different possible definitions. And with each of these words and descriptions and denominations, you have a folklore tale, you have a use, you have something. So, you know, I mean, for me, I just find it extremely violent to be told that forget about the common plant names, just learn the botanical Latin names, because especially in light of, you know, a whole kind of eco-social, you know, struggle that comes from kind of indigenous communities throughout the world, and we all know that we need to relearn. We all know that we need to kind of rekindle with the ancient definitions to understand the cosmologies and, you know, everything that surrounds plants that, you know, used to be our medicines, used to be our food, and so yeah, there are lots of texts. There's a really great issue of the magazine Third Text called "The Wretched Earth." So it's a pun on the wretched of the earth by Frantz Fanon, and it's an issue that's been edited by 2 people, Sheila Sher and Rose Gray, who both teach at Goldsmiths. In fact, there's an interesting Goldsmiths, an art college in London where I teach. They are starting an art research garden. So they have, they got hold of a garden. They've got multiple properties, and they've got a garden, and they're starting to think about what can a garden be? What can a garden mean? They're not really into the planting stuff at the moment. They do a lot of rituals, and they do a lot of readings and poetry, and try to open it out to the outside. But they also have an allotment which has a gate onto the main road, so it's accessible to people from outside. And these are really beautiful ideas as well. And these two people have written extensively around language and botany. Long answer for a short question, sorry.
And there's also one thing also that I find quite important is how like I've been always put front of the nature as like an example of what it's supposed to be normal. So we always say like, yeah, but look, in the nature it doesn't work like this. So in the nature there's like a male and a female, and the male is like making baby with the female, and then it's like how we shaped our way to see the world, and how we shaped the way to be together and like create relationship kind of, and we've been shaped on it. And then when you look actually in the nature, like, guys, this is so crazy weird. Like the nature is like actually incredibly queer. And if you look on this special example, it's just so liberating in a way. So it's also like what I personally go and look at when I'm doing this kind of research and kind of bring it here with you guys. It's also like to deconstruct kind of this logical idea of what's supposed to be nature and natural.
So yeah, thank you. Because now that I see your presentation, I can see the links also what we discussed back then. And what time is Thursday? Because I definitely want to be there. So what time?
I think it's 10.
We started then. Okay, ça va. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe it's time for dinner. Thank you very much.